Hey, welcome back to our classroom. We have a special guest here. All the guests are special, folks. Let me make that clear. But we have a guest here today that I'm connecting with for, I think, the second time. I think we met at NCTE years ago, but it's been a while since we've had conversation. Certainly, this connection on the social media platforms, on Twitter and whatnot, and Lorena's more connected to you. So, David, thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to have you on our classroom, and I'm excited to learn from you and with you.
Likewise, I love this podcast. Love the work that you do, that y'all both do, and so yeah, super happy to be here.
Thank you, thank you. So we'll go ahead and just jump right in. Your writing draws me in for a number of different reasons, and you address themes such as immigration and life on the border, which seems to be a focal point for you. And I'm wondering, why is this a focal point, and who are you writing for? And one of the reasons I'm asking is because I lived in Texas for 7 years. So when we moved from Massachusetts to Texas, I got to see some different things, and I got to hear some stories from people, and I got to experience some of what they were going through. And when I refer to them, I'm talking about individuals who either live on the border or were crossing the border, particularly youngsters. There's a lot of youngsters that I was in contact with through a particular organization. And so I have a big heart for individuals who experience life on the border, and who have stories that perhaps we, the general public, may not be as familiar with, and as a result, might not have as much empathy. And then the second reason is because my parents immigrated from the Dominican Republic. So the story of a family leaving behind their culture and coming over and adapting to culture in the United States, that hits close to home, even though I did not grow up and live on the border. And so these things I noticed in your writing, and it's drawn me in as a reader, and I'm interested to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on some things that are really important to me, but kind of like at the heart of my reason for exploring border stories and immigration stories is the fact that this is my community. My family on my dad's side, the Mexican American side, has lived in this transnational community of, the Rio Grande Valley and the northern part of Tamaulipas, the Mexican state, to our south for a couple of hundred years. Many of them came with Escandon, under when this was all New Spain. About several dozen families, both mestizo and indigenous Tlaxcalteca, came up out of the Saltillo area and settled here. So we've been living here for a long time, and our traditions, our way of life, all of these particularities that are so important to me and that are not reflected in a lot of literature and entertainment, and haven't been my entire life until really recently, and then only a trickle. They're the things that I want to share with the world. And primarily I want to share it with other Mexican Americans, especially young people from my community, so they can see themselves centered and celebrated in the pages of books, and the ins and outs of our lives depicted that way. But also for people who are not from this community, so they can understand our essential humanity. I think that a lot of people tend to think of the border as this kind of like post-apocalyptic landscape, where like tanks and like Mad Max warriors roam around and causing havoc and so forth. When in reality, it's like this really peaceful, loving community. And you've been to South Texas, you know how this is. But one of the things that increasingly has been a focus of my concern is the way that immigrants are treated. My wife is an immigrant from Mexico. She came across in her 20s, a few years before we met. And the way I've seen her treatment get progressively worse over the 3 decades that we've been married, and the way I've seen immigrants in our community who have a place here, we easily fold them into our workplaces and just the fabric of our lives. But the way they've been demonized and marginalized and mistreated by people at the federal government level, but also just throughout the conversation that we're having nationally is of concern to me. And so, also as a teacher, I taught middle school for 14 years, and then ran an English language arts and bilingual program at a local school district, and now I'm a professor at the university here. And my students in all of those roles have been uh, a mixture of long-term mestizos, Mexican Americans from the Valley, and then immigrants from both Mexico and other places, Central America and the Caribbean, and their concerns and the way that national conversation that's so ugly impacts their sense of self and self-worth and their ability to emerge as lifelong readers and writers and thinkers. That is what compels me to talk about them and talk about the issues they face.
That's you use the word demonize, and for our listeners who are ignorant, and I don't mean that in any disrespectful way, I'm truly using it as stating they don't know, they're not aware, for whatever the reason may be, of the way folks that cross the border are demonized. Do you mind providing an example or two?
Well, sure. I mean, in the first place, there is this attitude that the people who are coming are harmful in some way to our economy, to our law and order, to our way of life, that they're going to somehow dilute some essential American identity by coming in and bringing Spanish language or indigenous languages, like religious beliefs and just ways of looking at the world that are incompatible, a certain segment of our society would say, with the standard American way of doing things and thinking. And then, like I said, there's this worry about criminality and about the motives of people who are coming here, that they're coming to try to basically snatch food from the mouths of people in the US. In reality, these are people who are coming here mostly in accordance with international law, seeking asylum, refuge, because they are fleeing, terrible conditions, violence, threats, and so forth in their home countries. And the vast majority of them are extremely honest, family centric, hardworking, although that shouldn't be, in my opinion, a measuring stick for the value of somebody to this nation. But nonetheless, they are usually very hardworking, who come into this community, the strip of 60-mile strip of frontera where I live, and contribute quite a bit and make our lives better and richer, and are good friends and good community members. But that's not the way the rest of the world views them. And so you get unaccompanied minors being snatched up and put in these really horrible conditions, essentially cages, even to this day, even under the Biden administration, put in very cold places with like minimal comforts, and just kind of made to suffer. And the same holds true with families and so forth. And many of them are forced to wait in Mexico, camping out. My wife and I go across the border all the time to visit friends and family in our border towns here, and we constantly see these people who are not allowed to even step foot on U.S. soil halfway across the bridge, because at that point, international law says that they can request asylum. So this treating them like they are a danger to the U.S. as a justification for keeping them away, when ethically, morally, legally, they ought to be permitted to come in. That is what I refer to when I say demonization.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Uh-huh.
Now, back to your writing. How much of you shows up in your books?
I think a lot does. I mean, the Border Kids series, which started with They Call Me Güero, and then obviously has gone now to They Call Her Fregona. The main character, the narrator, the boy who writes poems and is telling these stories, is probably about 30% drawn from me. In fact, a lot of his actual experiences, especially in the first book, are basically pulled from my childhood and brought into the present time, because I'm 52. Obviously, I'm not 12.
Right.
But I would say, and then a lot of the rest of him is taken from my son, who's now 21 and lives in Austin, going to college there, but was a teenager when I was writing the first book, and other young men and boys that I've worked with over the decades here in my community of Donna, which is about 20 minutes from McAllen, for those who don't know. And so I wanted to, when I write characters from the border, I often, will pull from my own experience and from the experience of others, because there's an authenticity that derives from that, right? When you want to write about the experiences of members of a community, when you are a member of that community, pulling from what you know, what you've seen, what you've experienced, what others close to you have experienced, is the best way to authentically depict that community and those types of people. So definitely, I mean, that's why I do that. And of course, as a result, my characters tend to be a little bit like me. They tend to be like light-skinned Mexican Americans who are part of a community of color without being of color themselves necessarily. Having indigenous heritage, but having it be, genetically not obvious, and things like that, and grappling with colorism within the community, and like what that means to be 12 years old and realize that while your community is being demonized and othered and so forth, you within that community experience a privilege as a white presenting person to move through the world. And then you have to decide what you're going to do with that, because you can't renounce privilege. Privilege just comes and is there. And as a young person, that's a really tough thing to face. Like you maybe don't want privilege, because like in my family and in many other Mexican American families, there are people of varying shades of skin tones because of our mixed heritage. And I have my brother Fernando is really dark skinned. My brother Mateo is a little bit lighter skinned with hazel eyes, and you just know it's kind of like it's kind of roll of a dice, a genetic roll of the dice. But because of conquest and colonialism, we do have this colorist problem. And I think we see it writ large in the elections that we're just going through right now. The election, it's not election day, it's election season, basically, because who knows when we'll find out how it turns out. By the time people listen to this, hopefully we have hammered all that out. I think that pulling from my own experience as somebody who grapples with that privilege and has to navigate the way I'm perceived in my community and outside of my community, all that complexity gives a richness to my characters that otherwise would be missing, which is, the argument for writing what you know and writing within your lane, and an argument against people who are not from the Latino community or for the Mexican American community or the Dominican American community from writing as primary characters for as protagonists, people from our community, if they don't, belong, because they won't be able to capture those nuances.
I appreciate you naming that, particularly the colorism piece, because I feel like that's still a conversation that we need to dig deeper into within Spanish-speaking groups, within the Latino community and whatnot. It's a conversation I'd love to see us push even further.
I agree with you. There's a reckoning that's been centuries in coming, that needs to be grappled with, and I mean, again, I'm it's kind of depressing to talk about election results a little bit, but when you take a look at what's happened in Florida, and to some degree what's happening in South Texas and a couple other Southwest areas with Mexican Americans who their proximity to whiteness is like really intoxicating and pulls them into conservative. It's not the only thing. I mean, there's also like religious, faith-based concerns and so forth, that pull them towards conservative voting patterns. But I still think the color is in the heart of it. When I see the results in Georgia and see how many gente Latina decided to vote for Kemp instead of Stacey, like I just know in my heart, because I know my community, that colorism had something to do with that. It was a factor, not the deciding factor maybe, but it was a factor.
Absolutely.
Where where certain Hispanics, because that's what they would usually call themselves, are more likely to vote for a white candidate than a black candidate, regardless of the particular positions of either candidate, and that is depressing. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack. My goodness. But
Beyond the scope of this episode.
yes, absolutely. Maybe at NCTE, dig
We can
deeper.
sit down and have coffee and like chat it out.
Absolutely. So, how do you balance writing for children while also infusing the profound topics that you address? Not just in your books, but also on your social media platforms, where we see you go real deep on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean it's a very interesting juggling act. Especially when I'm writing for like much younger people. You know, it's with Border Kids poems with Güero and Fregona. You know, it's a little bit easier. I'm writing for an audience of kids who are, you know, on that verge of adolescence, and they're beginning to kind of push back a little bit, and so they're open to an exploration, a nuanced exploration of their community and the fractures within it, and so forth. But when I'm writing for younger kids, it gets really really tough. So you know, my two border towns, my first picture book, which just won the Tomas Rivera Mexican American Children's Book Award,
Felicidades.
gracias, is also dealing with these kinds of things. But the way I was able to accomplish it, I think, was couching the difficulties of asylum seekers and refugees being trapped between Mexico and the US in terms of the beauty of being able to live in both those towns, of being in a transnational community. So I spent about 3/4 of the book kind of like celebrating the amazing textures and flavors and nuances and joys of being a border kid, and then kind of have that twist at the end where we see, you know, children like camped out on the bridge, and just show the boy, the main character's kind of dismay at this. Like he's been going back and forth now for 6 months with this particular family living on the bridge from Cuba, and he's made really good friends with the boy, and he was like learning Cuban slang and stuff like that. And he gets along with them really well, and the two of them would be such wonderful friends if they were neighbors. And like, he wanted desperately for this boy to be able to come across the bridge, and then his father has to have that, you know, the hard talk with like, yes, there is room for him in our community, and yes, it's unfair. I agree, it's unfair. But you know, hopefully things will change, and when they do, and they're allowed to seek refuge in our country, we'll greet them with our arms wide open. And then the boy, I mean, there's some kind of hope. So the idea is you give children hope. You're honest with them about the complexities, couching them in terms the kids can understand, and then you give the kids hope. Because the last thing you want is to like damage children by saying, hey, you know, the world is a really terrible place, and lots of kids your age are suffering, and they will continue suffering forever. I mean, you don't want to do that. It's, you know, that's a posture that would you know, have an opposite effect from what you want, which is to have kids double down on their like their essential humanity. Like little kids are some of the most just, ethical, humane beings on the planet, and it's something that we kind of like slowly carve away at, as they get older, until they become, you know, sometimes callous and cynical.
You know, the way you were able to, I'm trying to find the right words. I don't want to say tone it down, but adjust. The way you're able to adjust to the audience is quite masterful. Yeah, I've been working on my young adult poetry book, and I'm not gonna lie, I've struggled at times in terms of bringing it down, or at least certain sections of the book. And I'm like, all right, you know, I like to be up here and get real tricky with the language, but I'm also, you know, speaking to audiences that at times that might be a little too much, and they need a little something simplistic,
Yeah.
something they could digest easily, and also something, as you just stated, that leaves them feeling encouraged. You know, because some of the pieces that I'm sharing, they're not going to do that, because I'm sharing my reality also.
Yeah.
Um, which
And
is
it's really dark
not that it's
sometimes.
all, yeah, right. I was gonna say it's not all gray, but you know, I don't want to hide that reality. At the same time, I do want to offer some hope. So I appreciate the way you are able to adjust for your audience, so that it gets across the message that you want to get across, that it reaches them in a tone and language that they could really receive, while also pushing their thinking, because your writing does
Yeah,
that. It
yeah.
accomplishes that. So
And I think that like interweaving and thinking of a poetry collection or a novel in verse is kind of like a quilt, where you can have this narrative thread that goes through the ups and downs of a typical narrative, and you weave into it moments of joy and distraction and just silliness or just whatever, just to try to balance things out, because life is all those things at once. You can be like dismayed at a particular thing that you see on social media in the morning, and then have a joyful breakfast with family, and then pivot to like trying to solve a problem in your community, and then trying to respond to some like negative press, while then maybe wrapping up at night with something joyful. Like, I mean, every single day is just this constant, complex interweaving of moments, and capturing that in a way that's that has verisimilitude, that has like realisticness in it, in a novel in verse, is tricky. But oh, when you nail it, it feels, you feel like wow. And you can do that the same thing with language, right? You can have some tricky, complex language that really pushes kids to the very edge of their zone of proximal development, and then you back off and have something like lighter and much more accessible. I mean, ultimately, I think you'd probably agree that poetry should be the language of the people and not the language of some ivory tower or academia or scholarship. Is as much as we can like open that up to people and make them feel comfortable, so that when we do challenge them, they're like, okay, I'm with somebody I trust. And Roberto's gonna challenge me, pero pues yo confío en él. Everything's gonna be okay. He's got me by the hand, and we'll get on the other side of this really dense language. So yeah, that's what I would recommend. Not that you're looking for a recommendation from me, but yeah.
no, no, lo recibo, cien por
Yeah.
ciento de acuerdo. So as it relates to your most recent book, They Call Her Fregona, what were you thinking about as you were writing the part of the story when the ice raid happens?
Yeah, I mean, that was inspired by something that literally did happen, in the early years of the former guy's time in the White House. And um, it was just so shocking to me. And it would have been shocking even if it had just been like a single incident, but there were multiple incidents of ICE raiding, factories and fields and all these things, snatching up families without any kind of thought for their children. I mean, we would hear, report after report in 2017, 2018, and 2019 of kids who just suddenly show up at home and their parents are not there and they don't know what's going on. And finally, you know, neighbors or family members who find out about the raid come and check on the kids, and they're cut off from their parents. It's like the most horrifying thing in the world. And in our own community, that's what was happening. And I wanted to grapple with, you know, how that feels for a child that's in that situation, but also like what it does to the community, especially when maybe part of the community is supportive of those kinds of things. And so it was, in the first book, we have Güero really kind of like celebrating his family and community and kind of like falling in love, not just with poetry, but with the ways in which it allows him to celebrate everything. And then in the second book, I wanted to like basically pull up a flagstone and flip it over so we could see like all the ants and cockroaches and stuff crawling under the in the underbelly, right? Um, and the ice raid is a way for me to that's like the metaphorical flipping of the flagstone in the book. And at that point, the book, which has been really relatively joyful and grappling with kind of like middle school kind of issues, it suddenly becomes really heavy, and everybody's life and all the things that have been going, all the threads get tinged with sorrow. And there's still moments of joy because joy doesn't stop, but everything is now kind of flavored differently. And when your joys and moments of great crisis become bittersweet, right? It's this weird alchemy that happens.
Deep, deep, deep. Thank you. And thank you for sharing even that part of the story and bringing a real situation to text so that the audience can grapple with that. I think the more that we talk about these matters, you've mentioned a few times the term essential humanity. I think the more we can really work towards that, right? Drawing people into that essential humanity, then hopefully we could have honest conversations about these actions and how they impact people and communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important because otherwise, these our communities are erased from the national conversation. They're out of sight, and it's easier then for people um, to not see us as human, and then to not feel brokenhearted when tragedy befalls us because they're like, oh, well, they're not us.
Right. So if you had an opportunity to have lunch with any author, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a hard question, Roberto. I mean, there's so many, but just because his work is on my mind, and I recently spent a bunch of time with his family in San Marcos. Tomas Rivera would be, I think, my pick today. His book, "Y no se lo tragó la tierra," Earth Did Not Devour Him, really opened the door for people to write about young Latinos with, honest complexity and literary dignity in a way that up to that point, because most of the books written about, Hispanic teens or Latinx folks were written by people who weren't from the community, and they were usually kind of like didactic, and the message was always, like in the 60s and 70s, well, I guess the 50s and 60s was always, you have problems, but if you would just learn to speak English well, if you would just, dress this particular way, cut your hair a particular way, ape the norms of, white Anglo society, everything would be fine. And that was invariably what would happen. And it was this book that was like, yeah, that's a bunch of nonsense. In reality, the things that in this book, young Mexican Americans are grappling with can't be solved by just assimilation. They are problems that assimilation will only exacerbate. And so it's a great book, really timely to this day. And I always recommend people revisit it. It's not written in a way that we would recognize as being middle grade or YA, despite the age of the character. It really, I don't think that Dr. Rivera was thinking in those terms when he was writing this book. It's more of an adult book with a young protagonist. But its relevance in the fact that it, along with Bless Me Ultima by Rudy Anaya, and then several decades, well, at least a decade and a half later, Sandra Snow's House of Mango Street. These are like key books that inspired a lot of my fellow Mexican American kid lit writers to be involved. But that's the text. That's the first one. Tomás Rivera, y no se lo tragó la tierra, written in Spanish originally, which is something that happens less and less and less in U.S. Letters and U.S. literary engagement. And so I would love to pick his brain. I would probably just spend my entire time just like fangirling over him and whatever, because he was just such a brilliant man and just so eloquent both in English and in Spanish, and with such a big heart. Just there's a reason that this award, the Tomas Rivera Mexican American Children's Book Award, is named after him, because he like literally did open that door. So
amazing. Thank you for sharing that and inspiring us to go read some works by Tomas Rivera. David, where can folks follow you?
Sure, they can totally find me on social media, especially if they want to be challenged in lots of interesting ways.
Yes.
It's at David O. Bowles, both Instagram and Twitter. I have a Facebook account where I don't post as often, but yeah, Twitter is my thing. We'll see for how much longer, but
right.
I'm gonna stick around until Elon Musgo me bota la fregada. Well, I was gonna wait until then. He's gonna have to throw me out.
Va a ser como en Titanic.
Yeah, seeking, and I'm gonna be like playing my little violin. my ex-Floridian.
Exactamente. Yes, yes.
And
The
then
band keeps playing.
it's gonna be there's a whole bunch of us like activists that'll be there like until the very last minute. We're like, all right, now jump on the door and see how many of us survive. Uh, well, I'm not gonna be like Jack. I'm not gonna be in the water. I'm gonna be on the door.
Yeah, no, the water's gonna be
All the Titanic fans are like, oh, is it too soon? And then my website is davidbowles.us, so you can check me out there too.
Well, David, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. It was so insightful to hear from you, to learn a little bit about how you approach your writing, to dig into your books. Wonderful works. I know we have a couple copies over here of Güero and Fregona, and they are staple characters in this household.
Well, I appreciate that. Appreciate the support and friendship and collegiality. And see you at NCTE, bro.
Absolutely, can't wait. And we'll have to dig in over coffee you mentioned.
Yeah,
Yo tomo café con leche.
yo también.
Okay,
So
okay.
it'll work just fine. Un abrazo a Lorena and see you very soon.
All
Thanks.
right, take care. Peace.
Bye.